And in this third part of our lecture today, this is the third lecture for our series of lectures for this week. I just wanted to say a few quick things. First of all, just to remind us of a few names that are worth checking out, and I really encourage you, to do some, research. I mean, it can't hurt you. Listen to some music, some blues music. I mentioned Bessie Smith. The story of the man who gave his soul to the devil for music is the story of Robert Johnson, who was one of the early pioneers of the blues. Recorded very small, some recordings and some, but it's recognized as one of the most dynamic and interesting pioneers of the blues. He had a short life, but in that short life, he produced some great music. There are other artists like Lead Belly, um, who would have a long career as a blues musician, and whose recordings are quite powerful and quite important. Blind Lemon Jefferson is another artist and these are artists that you can easily find online and listen to them and just think about what I've talked about, which is the question of the structure of the music, the themes and the subjects that the musicians write about and they think about. Which moves us to jazz, and I'll say a few words about jazz. We'll speak more about jazz when we start thinking of some of the writers writing about jazz and blues. Somebody like Langston Hughes. When we look at Langston Hughes, the Negro artist, and the Racial Mountain, or when we reread James Baldwin's short story novella, Sonny's Blues. And it's important to have a basis for reading these works because the fact is that much of African American literature is still predicated on the blues, jazz, and the Negro spirituals as archetypal forms, as iconic forms that help to shape the poetics in which they're writing, whether they're writing against those types or they're writing inside of those types and emerging with a poetics that grows out of it. Briefly, I would say that jazz begins. We begin to call it jazz effectively from New Orleans, its early days, and there are a number of really brilliant documentaries on the music. There's a PBS documentary on jazz music that is worth looking at. There's a fantastic documentary on Louis Armstrong that came out a few years ago that looks at his life. And Louis Armstrong Satchmo was one of the first pioneers of music. There's an interesting documentary on Miles Davis, the Ella Fitzgerald. These are all sort of great composers, and there are a number of fascinating biographies on Duke Ellington, one of the great pioneers of jazz. And the list will start to grow, right, significantly. But it really is understood to have begun as a music form that took shape in the um, in the early 1900s in New Orleans, and it began, as with most music forms, they evolved from other music forms. Some people mark the circumstance of the emergence of jazz around the politics of race in New Orleans. Um, once a major, interestingly, a major Supreme Court decision was made, the Plessy decision, which made it possible for the South to enact um, segregation by law. That is, they could say, blacks could not go on trains, blacks could not, they had black and white separate spaces and so on and so forth. What that did was, in a place like New Orleans, where those segregational lines were not always upheld, it began to draw a line between sort of the Creole population, which was a mixed race kind of population, but still influenced by African Americans, and the white population, and to separate them where they seem to be more porous before that. And it also created a line that moved the Creole population towards inside the black population. These became the minoritized people, the racially minoritized people. It turns out that that led to this interesting circumstance where musicians who were normally part of white led and white performing big bands and marching bands could no longer be a part of it, and so they became part of these. They became part of this other group, which involved black people and Native American people, and of course these Creole mixed race people. Essentially, jazz comes out of that circumstance. So it brings together the music forms that were directly related to African music forms with European traditions, European instruments, whether it's clarinet, whether it's trumpet, whether it's saxophone, and so on and so forth. And they convert into creating this new form. And the new form would eventually be called jazz music. There's other forms of music that were taking place during that same period, the early 1900s, and these would converge together and create this musical form called jazz. Now, if you listen to early jazz, it's doing very interesting things to melody. It's doing every interesting to syncopation. It's doing very interesting things and different things than European music to composition and construction. And it's of course doing very interesting things to melody. But it's also dance music. It's really, really party music. And it's music that was emerging out of the clubs, emerging out of brothels. It's emerging. I mean, Louis Armstrong grew up in a brothel. That's where he grew up. That's where he learned to play his music and literally had his life developed around that. But what begins to happen is that the emergence of jazz coincides with the emergence of the recording. The recording industry, the recording technology. That is, people could now make music, but could record that music. And I think you have to think carefully about how revolutionary recording music would be, right? Because what would happen is that prior to recording music, all you have to do is use your imagination. Um, you could only access your music by either playing it, singing it, or going to hear it performed. And there are limits to that, where you are in the world. So for many years, what we think of as downloads of music that you can buy a record or whatever it is that we're doing, once the recording industry began, used to be music was passed around by sheet music. I mean, families would buy sheet music, and then somebody would be at home and they would play the piano, and everybody would be singing the songs and so on and so forth. This is how we had music. Nobody ever heard Beethoven play. Um, um, after his time was over and he died, we only know that we have the sheet music and the account of people who said this is what it sounds like, but there's no recording of Beethoven's own playing or music being played at the time of Beethoven. There's no recording of it, so we can only approximate it by creating it now. Whereas we can still listen to Duke Ellington in 1923, right? Over 100 years ago. We can listen to his music and listen to exactly what it sounded like because of the recording industry. And the recording industry changes everything. So when jazz musicians begin to record their music, it becomes more and more accessible to the world. And jazz then becomes a very big part of the American life and American understanding of themselves. The fact is that, and many have simply articulated it, some of the great American composers have have, Gershwin and many others have declared jazz as America's first classical form. In other words, jazz is America's classical, uh, quintessentially American form. And that is a form that is invented in America, developed and expanded in America, and would come to be influential throughout America. Right? And writers would begin to explore jazz, the construction of jazz, the way that jazz is organized. All right, and I would say a few things about the organization of jazz, and that would help us to think about it as a poetics in the most basic of ways. One of the great thinkers about this subject, who was not an American, but one Caribbean man called Kamal Brathwaite, came up with a very interesting idea. Of course, there was a difference between the big band, which is the big band was the period when people like Louis Armstrong had massive bands and the jazz musicians would play. By the time we get into the 1940s and so on, we get into these smaller combos, and that would be the bebop era. And the bebop era would feature people like Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, and Coltrane, and a whole set of people, and that would be in the 1940s into the 1950s. But the interesting thing is that jazz was predicated constructively. Jazz is predicated on a theme that is played. We hear the theme, da 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 da, familiar song, favorite things, and then after the theme is played, there's improvisational uh, solos based on the theme. All right, and so each artist will take it, improvise on it, and create new sides to that melody and so on and so forth. And then the whole group will then come back to play the theme. All right, it's basic compositional structure. But the great genius took place in the improvisation, and the improvisation was that artists could come off sheet and create new sounds, echo, pull from different things, sample things in their singing, in their playing, sample other songs and so on and so forth, and put it inside that framework. There's something quite dynamic about that on the spot improvisation and expression that jazz music would constitute. And if you think about it, there's a sense in which improvisation as a literary form, a literary practice, where ideas echo off each other, where ideas move slant and move in indirect ways, creating assonance and dissonance, creating harmonics and then sometimes anti-harmonic sounds. All of these things are in many ways replicated by many artists in terms of writing in literature, but trying to replicate the kind of improvisatory nature of jazz music. And jazz music becomes massively influential in any understanding of American life and American practice and American critical culture. So I'll leave it at there about jazz because we're going to come back to this subject a little later on. But do read the section on jazz. Read the section. It's beautifully written section on jazz. Tells you the history of jazz and, of course, tells you about the poetics of jazz, which will become very important for our discussion later on.